She was 7 years old, standing in a whiteout at the edge of Riverton General's parking lot, with a clear plastic lemonade jug gone half slush, half ice, one hand cupped around paper cups softening in the snow, and a cardboard sign that bowed in the wind hard enough to hide and reveal the same 4 words over and over. Lemonade $1 for my brother. Her mittens were dark with meltwater to the wrists. Snow packed itself into the torn seam on the left sneaker, and each time she shifted her weight, the wet canvas gave a small, sucking sound against the blacktop. Her knees shook so hard that the cup in her hand clicked against her front teeth. She wasn't crying. She is 7. The wind is driving sideways now. Fine needles of ice stinging the skin beneath her eyes where the knit cap has slipped back, and the jug handle has frozen enough that she has to pry her fingers open and close to keep grip. 12 cars cut past her, toward the emergency awning in less than 4 minutes, headlights washed pale by the storm, wipers frantic, tires hissing through slush. Nobody rolls down a window. By the time she lifts one cup toward each set of taillights, the red glow is already gone into the curtains of snow. She keeps lifting it anyway. Then she was back in the hour that would later be time-stamped and replayed and slowed down by people trying to explain themselves. The revolving doors coughed open and shut in uneven rhythm. Heat rushed out, then vanished. Antiseptic and burnt coffee from the volunteer cart spilled into the cold, then diesel from an idling shuttle bus swallowed it. At 4:58 on a Thursday in late January, the sky over Caldwell had already gone that flat iron color that made afternoon look like evening. Hospital lights came on in strips behind fogged glass, and the child remained where the yellow curb paint ended, small enough that the plow berm behind her reached almost to her shoulders. A young father in a Titan's beanie took one look at the sign and looked away so quickly it seemed practiced. 2 women with hospital badges paused, spoke to each other with their chins tucked in their scarves, and hurried on. An older man in a tan Buick slowed, drifted toward her, then jerked his wheel toward the covered lane when a horn barked behind him. A pastor from First Assembly, collar hidden under a down coat, crossed the lot with his Bible zipped in a canvas case, and did not break stride. Snow collected along the top edge of her sign until she had to knock it off against her knee. The cardboard made a dead, wet sound. She tried to pour with mittened hands and failed, peeled one mitten off with her teeth, and poured with fingers gone red and stiff around the handle. The lemonade came out in pale chunks in yellow water that smelled faintly sweet and mostly cold. She held the cup out to a woman dragging an oxygen tank bag behind her. The woman flinched as if touched by static, murmured something the wind took, and kept walking. The child set that same cup on the curb beside her boot and picked up another. She repeated the motion so steadily that it stopped looking like hope and started looking like work. Across the drive, through the glass panel by the information desk, a volunteer watched for a while and then looked down at her phone. A security guard at the interior vestibule pressed his palm against the cracked automatic door to keep it from sticking and muttered about maintenance into his shoulder radio. The draft coming through that crack carried needles of cold all the way to the pediatric elevators. Nobody told the girl to come in. Nobody told her to leave either, which in places like that passed for permission. By 5:17, the cup she had used first had frozen to the curb. She twisted it free, tore a crescent from the rim, and set it back on top of the stack like the rip did not matter. Her sleeves stopped 2 inches above her wrists. Someone had once stitched one cuff by hand with blue thread that did not match the coat. The stitches had held, the coat had not. Snow lodged in the loose loops and turned them white. She kept watching every face for the half-second when people looked directly at her sign and calculated. and she lowered her eyes before they could lower theirs first. What witnesses remembered later, and what sat in their throats when they tried to speak about that evening, was not the sign and not the weather, and not even the size of her hands around the cups. It was the composure. She was not shivering theatrically or begging, not calling out, not doing any of the things adults told themselves would have made intervention obvious. She was simply there, standing in a storm with a little sales pitch, printed in marker, and the patient concentration of someone balancing numbers in her head. She wasn't crying. That was the detail it would hold. At 5:31, the county wind advisories updated on 3 local stations. At 5:34, the first scanner call came from a sanitation driver crossing the river bridge. Unusual motorcycle traffic inbound from Route 11, heavy count, staggered formation. At 5:36, dispatch logged another sighting from the East Frontage Road, then another from the old textile mill turnoff, each report adding pieces to one moving shape. Black bikes under whitening snow, headlights in lines that did not break. Riders spaced with military precision. No weaving, no revving for show, no one racing ahead. It looked less like a crowd and more like deployment. By 5:40, somebody in the emergency waiting room said the number out loud, and once numbers are spoken in public, they become weather of their own. 300? The word moved from chair to chair faster than any official notice. 300 bikers coming into the hospital district in a storm. A mother with a sleeping toddler pulled the child closer and checked the lock on her diaper bag zipper. A man in work boots stood to get a better angle through the glass and whispered that this was how trouble started, with noise and leather and nobody in charge. The clerk at admissions stopped stamping forms long enough to watch the entrance and then resumed, but slower. From the third-floor family lounge, Nurse Sandra Briggs, 46 and 11 years on nights, saw the convoy lights first as blurred points through sleet and thought for one hard beat that the rumor had outrun the truth. Then the sound reached the building. Not a burst, not a stunt throttle scream, but a deep layered pressure that got into the window panes and the hollow steel rails and the sternum. Engines. Hundreds of engines. The old assumptions arrived on schedule. With the sound. Bar fights, warrants, men to avoid. She had thought those assumptions herself for years. Most people in Caldwell had. On the county channel, dispatch counted sectors and repeated caution language while units reported visual confirmation at the same time from opposite approaches, which meant the formation had wrapped the district without speeding once. 300 helmets, dark with wet. 300 sets of shoulders under leather and road salt. 300 machines idling at lights they could have ignored but didn't. In the parking lot, people flattened to the inner side of glass doors and watched the line of chrome and black fold through the storm toward Riverton General. And for one deliberate breath, the whole town believed something violent was about to step inside. At 5:43, Doug Fletcher shouldered through those same doors with a folder of VA denial letters tucked under his arm, wind needling through the crack before the door dragged shut behind him. His scar bright against skin gone cold, his knees clicking once on the tile as he adjusted his weight. He smelled snow, antiseptic, diesel, wet wool, and the old faint bite of fear that institutions carried after hours. He came to argue a reimbursement code he could not afford to lose. He did not yet know that 1 floor below, a child had already been paying a different bill in paper cups. The admissions clerk looked up at him, then past him, then back to the folder, under his arm as if paperwork could still keep its rank over weather and rumor. Her badge said, Melissa Crow, and the lanyard had cracked where she worried it with her thumb. Billing closed at 5:30, she said. Storm protocol. She said it quickly, with the brittle authority of someone repeating policy to keep from naming fear. Through the glass behind her, the outer lane filled with headlights that did not flare or fishtail. They moved in paired intervals and stopped exactly where the painted arrows told them to stop. People waiting for triage watched them the way people watched a brush fire, crossing a ridgeline, still and prepared for bad news. Doug set the folder down on the counter and kept one hand over it. His knuckles were split and pale from cold, scar tissue ridged like old rope under the skin. He heard the engines through the vestibule before he saw the riders clearly. That heavy, synchronized cadence that came up through tile and steel and made the vending machine glass buzz. A man in construction coveralls stood near the coffee machine and muttered, "Lord help us," not to anybody in particular. A teenage volunteer in a pink scrub top pulled the curtain around the pediatric play nook as if cloth could block what was outside. Nobody in the room used the word danger, but the word stood there anyway, plain as a wet coat on a hook. He knew 3 of those bikes by sound alone. A Road King with a left cylinder that always idled low, a Dyna with an aftermarket cam that gave it a clipped bark at every downshift, and Reggie Pike's old Electra Glide, whose timing chain had a faint, metallic tick after 30 minutes in freezing weather. Doug didn't need to see their cuts to know what chapter had come in from the county roads. Iron Covenant had a winter run schedule, taped to the cinder block wall of their clubhouse, and none of those runs came through Riverton at this hour unless somebody made it personal. He looked at the parents and grandmothers pressed against the chairs and thought how quickly a silhouette becomes a sentence in a stranger's mind. The paradox had already arrived, idling 30 yards from the automatic doors while the town braced for the wrong thing. Sometimes the men people taught their children to avoid were the first men to answer a call nobody else heard. Sometimes what looked like threat from behind glass was the only form protection, knew how to take on short notice in bad weather. Doug had spent enough years being the shape people stepped around to recognize that moment before it was spoken. Fear on one side of the door, duty on the other, and no one yet ready to admit they had them reversed. At 5:46, a security guard with a silver mustache and a knee brace moved to the vestibule and clicked his radio twice. "All units hold interior posts," he said. His voice went thin at the edges. "No engagement unless requested." Another guard, younger and broad-shouldered, slid the crash bar lock into place and then hesitated, glancing toward an elderly woman in a wheelchair who had started to cough from the draft. Outside, the riders killed their engines almost in sequence, sound collapsing from thunder to ticking metal and wind. Helmets came off. Steam lifted from wet leather. Not one man shouted. Not one man tried the door. A boy of maybe 10, wrapped in a hospital blanket, printed with blue whales, leaned against his mother and stared out with wide, unblinking concentration. "Are they mad?" he asked. The mother pulled the blanket tighter around him and did not answer. Doug watched one biker stoop to pick up a glove that had fallen from another rider's saddlebag, then pass it over without a word. Another rider pulled a reflective vest from his pannier and handed it to a hospital valet who looked too shocked to refuse. These were small movements, logistical movements, the grammar of people expecting to work, not to perform. The waiting room did not know what to do with that. Melissa cleared her throat and pushed the folder back toward Doug, as if concluding a transaction neither of them had finished. "Sir, if you're here for billing, come back tomorrow," she said. "Roads are going to close by 7. Her eyes flicked toward the glass again. "You should probably head out before this turns into—" She left the end of the sentence open. Doug took the folder and tucked it under his arm, then looked at the line of riders now standing in slush with shoulders bowed to sleet. "Into what?" he asked, not challenging, just exact. Melissa didn't answer. She didn't have a word for men standing still in weather that hard. He shifted his weight and felt his left knee click twice, an old joint complaint from too mmany drops onto concrete, and too many winters pretending pain was optional. The fluorescent lights over admissions flickered in a pattern he remembered from his last visit, one tube out of sync with the rest, pulsing every 9 seconds and turning faces briefly gray. In that pulse, he saw fear harden into certainty in the room around him. The old equation reasserting itself because it was familiar. Leather plus numbers plus noise equals trouble. The equation had survived decades, precisely because it required no evidence. Doug walked away from the desk before Melissa could call him back. He passed the chapel alcove where the votive rack had been replaced with battery candles after a fire inspection in 2019, past a corkboard with volunteer meal schedules curling at the corners, past a framed donor plaque missing 2 brass letters from one surname. He kept moving toward the elevators, and the building's layered smells rearranged around him. Antiseptic first, then steam heat from overworked radiators, then wet wool from coats hung on every chair, then fryer grease from the cafeteria that had closed at 4 but still leaked through the service corridor. Snow hissed against the narrow windows by the stairwell, like handfuls of sand thrown at glass. By 5:52, he was in the north elevator with 2 respiratory techs and a janitor pushing a yellow mop bucket with 1 cracked caster. Nobody spoke. The car shuddered at each floor and stopped half a second too long before the doors opened. An old hydraulic hesitation everyone in Riverton General had learned to lean through without comment. On the second floor, 1 tech stepped off and the other stayed on, pressing the button for ICU with a gloved thumb gone raw at the knuckle. Doug watched the corridor slide by in pieces as the doors closed again. Hand sanitizer dispensers, faded mural fish outside pediatrics, a bulletin board with construction paper snowflakes cut by volunteers whose names were written in marker and crossed out when they quit. He stepped off on 3 because billing records used a back office near accounting after hours, then found the hallway dark beyond the nurses' station, half the lights out to conserve power during storm load. A paper sign taped to a locked glass door read, "Billing operations suspended due to weather event. Return 8 a.m. next business day." The ink had run at the edges where someone's wet sleeve brushed it. He stood there with the folder and listened to distant alarms chirp and reset, the minor mechanical cries of a hospital that never slept and never fully kept up. Wind came through somewhere it shouldn't have, carrying cold along the baseboards. Riverton General had been built in 1978 on county bond money, and patched in every decade since with grants, bake sale funds, deferred maintenance, and the stubborn labor of people paid less than the burden they carried. The West Wing still had original terrazzo floors with aggregate stones worn smooth under gurney wheels. The pediatric wing had newer paint, only where mold remediation forced replacement in 2021, and the line between old and new white ran jagged at shoulder height, down the corridor like a shoreline. In winter, the automatic doors at the east entrance failed to seal on the first try, so maintenance wedged a folded towel at the lower track after midnight. Everyone knew this. Everyone worked around it. The cold still got in. He took the service stairs down 1 level because the elevator bank had started lagging under generator transfer. The stairwell paint peeled in thumb-sized moons near the handrail, exposing older layers. Hospital beige, then mustard, then a green from another era. On the landing between 3 and 2, he stopped because the engine noise outside had changed shape. No longer a wall of sound, but intermittent bursts, bikes repositioning in short, controlled movements. He could hear shovels striking packed snow in the loading area below, metal edges scraping concrete in steady rhythm. Not mayhem. Tasking. He stood in that narrow stairwell and understood, with the blunt certainty of a man who had once lived by radio brevity codes, that those riders had come under orders. Around 5:54, when security cycled the east vestibule to move the coughing wheelchair patient away from the draft, the 7-year-old at the curb slipped in, with her lemonade jug hugged to her chest. A transporter, mistaking her for family overflow from emergency intake, pointed her toward the warmer pediatric corridor upstairs, and she went without argument. At 5:58, he opened the door to the second-floor family corridor outside pediatric respiratory and stepped into a strip of overheated air that smelled faintly of orange cleaner, stale crackers, and the medicinal sweetness of nebulizer mist drifting from under closed doors. The radiator along the wall hissed and knocked, then hissed again. A television bolted high in the corner played local weather with the volume muted, captions lagging one line behind the meteorologist's mouth. Beneath it sat a row of molded plastic chairs in 3 different shades of blue from years of piecemeal replacement. A vending machine hummed and flashed, sold out over 2 rows of crackers and all 3 rows of bottled water. There, halfway between the vending machine and room 214, a child sat cross-legged on the tile with a lemonade jug beside her boot, counting damp dollar bills into careful rows of 5 as if arithmetic could hold back a storm. Her coat sleeves stopped short of her wrists. One mitten lay on the floor, inside out, slowly drying into a stiff shape by the radiator. She kept her eyes on the money and not on the adults passing, and each time she finished a row, she flattened it with the side of her hand, deliberate and practiced. Doug did not move for one full breath. Then he set his folder on the nearest chair and went down on one knee so he would not have to look at her from above. The tile bit through the denim at his knee, and the joint answered with a dry pop that he ignored because the child in front of him was sorting damp $1 bills with the concentration of a bookkeeper and the hands of someone who still needed help tying skates. Her fingers were red to the knuckles. She pressed each bill flat against her thigh before laying it down, 5 in a row, then another 5, then another, as if neatness might make the number larger. The lemonade jug leaned against the vending machine with a crescent of ice floating at the top. One paper cup sat upside down on the floor beside it, stuck by a ring of yellow slush that had melted and refrozen. Doug kept both hands visible, palms open on his raised knee. Old instincts. Men who entered rooms carrying too much history learned to look non-threatening first and speak second. The corridor lighting made the scar under his left cheekbone look deeper than it was, a pale seam that started just below the ear and bent forward like a hooked finger. The first time he got that scar, he was 21, and convinced pain made men sharper. By 51, he knew pain mostly made men tired, and tired men were one bad second away from wrecking something they could not repair. He said, "You counting for the machine?" She shook her head once without looking up. Her hair had been brushed that morning, parted clean and pinned on one side with a plastic clip shaped like a yellow flower. The clip was still there, holding. Snowmelt had darkened the ends. That detail caught him harder than the wet shoes did. Somebody had cared enough to part her hair straight in a mirror before the day went wrong. He glanced toward room 214. The door was closed, narrow window fogged at the lower edge from warm air inside, meeting colder corridor glass. Pediatric respiratory was printed on the wall in cheerful letters beside cartoon kites that had faded from sunlight. At 6:01, the muted weather captions rolled across the television above them and lagged behind the meteorologist's moving mouth by 2 lines. Doug had spent half his life in places where noise meant danger and silence meant worse. Kuwait had taught him what incoming sounded like through sheet metal and dust. County lockup had taught him what a hallway felt like 3 seconds before a fight you did not want reached your bunk. Years on winter roads had taught him how to read black ice by the way taillights moved 50 yards ahead. The hospital corridor offered all 3 lessons at once. Machine hum, distant alarms, doors opening and shutting in soft hydraulic sighs, plus the hard, unnatural quiet around this child as adults passed and chose not to ask why she was counting money on tile. He heard boots before he looked up. Sandra Briggs came around the corner carrying a chart and a styrofoam cup gone soft at the rim. Dark hair pulled tight, reading glasses sliding down her nose the way they always did on the back half of a shift. She slowed when she saw him on one knee. Her gaze moved from his cut to the child, then to the rows of bills. She had the quick, appraising look of nurses who had learned to triage without asking permission. For a second, old Caldwell habits flickered across her face. Leather, tattoos, trouble. Then she saw the dollar rose and adjusted the chart against her hip. "You family in 214?" she asked. The girl's fingers paused, then resumed. Doug answered without standing. "Not yet." Sandra held his eyes for a beat long enough to measure tone, not posture. "He's on a Neb treatment," she said, meaning the boy in 214, then tipped her head toward the child. "She's been out here since before 6. Doug nodded once. Sandra moved on, shoes whispering on tile, and the smell of coffee followed her down the hall like a brief warm draft. Not yet sat with him after she turned the corner. It was the kind of line he would have mocked 20 years earlier, back when he still believed belonging had to be legal, blood documented. Then came the divorce papers delivered by certified mail because in person was deemed unsafe. Then came his oldest son, mailing back a birthday check with void written across it in heavy black marker and no note attached. Then came years of motel sinks, machine shops, bike rallies, VA waiting rooms, and men who called each other brother because they had run out of words that still felt honest. Family became whoever stayed in the room when staying got inconvenient. The child reached for the inside-out mitten and did not put it on. It had gone stiff where the knit had frozen and thawed twice. She used it to blot water off one bill and set the mitten back down. Her coat was too small across the shoulders, one cuff hand-stitched in blue thread that did not match, same thread he had seen whitened with snow outside. Cardboard peeked from the torn seam in her left sneaker, cut to fit the sole and dark from wet. He had worn cardboard in boots during one winter outside Yuma when his pay had been 3 days late, and his pride had been 7 days too early to ask for help. He said, "What's your name, kid?" A pause. Then, "Lily." Her voice was flat from cold and from holding steady for too long. Not timid, not dramatic, the tone of someone reporting inventory. "Doug," he said. She nodded as if she was filing the fact away. Across his back, old tattoo lines pulled when he shifted, ink sun-faded to green-blue maps of places and units, and dates that meant less to strangers every year. 8 years in the Marines had left him with a spine that woke stiff, ears that rang in quiet rooms, and an internal clock that still marked exits first and windows second. 14 months in county had added other habits. Never sleep with both shoes off, never turn your back in a line, never mistake polite language for safety. People liked redemption stories neat, one turning point, one speech. His life had been a long accumulation of smaller refusals to get worse. He looked again at the rows of bills. 3 full rows of 5. A 4th row with 2 singles and a damp 5 folded in half. $22. He could read numbers faster than he could read faces. 22 did not buy much in a hospital after dark. From the stairwell came a low vibration, then another, then quiet. Engines outside repositioning in controlled bursts. No revving, no yelling, just task noise, men moving machines into useful places. Lily lifted the envelope from her lap and slid the counted bills into it with careful thumbs. The envelope had once been white, now soft and gray at the corners, with 4 ELI written on the front in heavy marker and a sticker of a smiling dinosaur near the flap. She sealed nothing. She held it against her coat with both hands and looked at room 214's window as if sight alone could keep the person inside attached to this side of the door. Doug followed her gaze. In the narrow pane he could make out only motion and a pale shape on a bed. A monitor beeped in measured intervals from somewhere inside. The sound was thin through the door, but steady. "When did you eat?" he asked. She frowned slightly, counting backward in her head the way children do when time is a stack of events, not hours. "I had crackers," she said. "From the machine. They got stuck." He looked at the vending display. Sold out glowed over both cracker rows. She had likely bought the last packet and fought the spiral coil until gravity surrendered it. He reached into his vest pocket and found 2 wrapped peppermints, linty but intact, leftovers from a diner in Kingston. He set them on the tile between them, not pushing them closer, letting her decide. She looked at the wrappers, then at him, then took one and put it in her coat pocket instead of her mouth. Smart. Save it for later. Doug's right hand moved to the folder he had left on the chair, then stopped. VA denials, codes, signatures, pages that told him to come back tomorrow and prove again he deserved what was already owed. He had come to fight that fight tonight because late fees did not care about weather. Yet here was a 7-year-old who had set up a lemonade stand in a blizzard to cover a copay no child should have been able to pronounce, let alone raise. His jaw tightened. The muscle jumped once below the scar. People like to say men like him acted from rage. Sometimes that was true. Rage had put him in handcuffs at 36 after a bar stool came up too fast and a bottle went where it should not have gone. Rage had cost him jobs, rooms, holidays, but rage had never kept him upright at 3 a.m., outside an ICU when a friend's wife went into surgery and nobody else answered their phone. Rage had never taught him to carry spare gloves in winter for strangers at truck stops. Something else did that. Something quieter and more stubborn. The corridor door opened at the far end and a hospital volunteer came through, pushing a cart of folded blankets, crosspin on her scarf catching fluorescent light. She saw Lily on the floor and hesitated, eyes bouncing to Doug, then to the nurse's station. She did not stop. She parked the cart by the desk and began counting stacks, lips moving with the numbers. Doug watched her avoid the scene with bureaucratic precision and felt a familiar weight settle in his chest. Not surprise, not even anger anymore, just recognition. He said, "Lily, where's your mom at?" She shook her head. "Dad?" Another shake, smaller. "Who brought you in?" "Mr. Theo with the wheelchair," she said. "He said upstairs was warmer." "The transporter?" She nodded. "He had a penguin keychain." Doug pictured the older transporter with the limp and the stuffed penguin dangling from his badge reel. Good man. Not paid enough to carry what he saw each shift. Lily turned the envelope over and traced the dinosaur sticker with one finger. When she spoke again, she did not look at him. "They said 7 to 10 business days," she whispered. The words landed with adult cadence borrowed from a window clerk and memorized because she had no choice. Doug felt the back of his neck go hot despite the draft under the door. "For what?" he asked, though he already knew. For help money. Her voice thinned on the second word and steadied again. But Eli needs it now. Room 214's monitor changed pitch for 2 beats and returned. Lily's eyes went to the door instantly, alert as a field medic hearing a tone shift over radio static. No crying, no panic, just calibration. He lowered himself the rest of the way until he was sitting on the floor beside her, back against the wall, knees out because they would not fold clean anymore. The tiles stole heat through his jeans. He took his gloves off and tucked them in his belt. His hands looked like what they were, broad, scarred, 2 fingers permanently thick at the joints from breaks set badly decades earlier. He placed them flat on his thighs, empty. "You did good math," he said. She gave a tiny nod, still watching the door. "How much they tell you it was?" $38.40. He did the subtraction automatically. "You're short $16.40. She pressed the envelope tighter to her chest. "I was going to go back out." Outside, through 2 walls and glass, the muffled thunder of idling motorcycles eased and settled into an organized pulse. Snow brushed the windows in steady sheets. Somewhere below, a shovel scraped concrete in measured strokes. Doug looked toward the stairwell, then back to Lily. The decision had already made itself in him before his thoughts caught up, the same way his body had moved on convoy roads when a tire blew and the truck started to yaw. Training first, explanation later. He leaned forward enough that she could hear him without strain and kept his voice low, plain, exact. "You're not going back out tonight." That got her eyes on him for the first time. They were gray-green, ringed dark with fatigue, old in the way exhausted children sometimes looked, as if they had borrowed years from tomorrow. She studied his face, the scar, the weathered leather, the patches, and whatever she found there made her shoulders drop a fraction. "Please don't let them stop his medicine," she whispered. Doug held her gaze and nodded once. "They won't." He did not make promises lightly. Then he reached for the flip phone in his inside pocket and wrapped his hand around it, without dialing yet, listening to the corridor, to the monitor, to the storm, and to the low engine pulse outside that sounded less like threat than readiness. He kept his thumb on the hinge of the flip phone and did not open it yet. The corridor breathed around him in mechanical cycles. Radiator hiss, vent rattle, a cartwheel with one bad bearing ticking over grout lines, the thin monitor pulse behind room 214's door. Lily sat close enough that he could feel the cold still trapped in her coat sleeve when it brushed his wrist. She watched him and the phone together, then lowered her gaze to the envelope again, pressing its softened edges back into shape with careful fingers. Across the hall, the muted weather map flashed county lines in warning colors, while captions crawled a sentence behind. Sandra Briggs came back from the nurse's station carrying a tablet instead of a chart this time, glasses pushed up with the back of her wrist because both hands were full. She stopped 3 chairs away, not crowding them, and took in the scene with that same triage calm that never looked hurried and never wasted motion. Her coffee was gone. Her badge had a strip of white tape across the bottom, where an older surname used to be. She said, "Social workers off till morning. House supervisors in surgery overflow." Then she looked at Lily's shoes and added, quieter. She shouldn't have been out there that long. Doug lifted his chin toward the tablet. "How long was she out there?" Sandra turned the screen so he could see the camera grid. One pane frozen on the parking lot curb, where the snow blew sideways under sodium lights, and the shape of a small child held the same square of ground through changing traffic. A timestamp burned in the corner of each clip. "First, clear image at 3:06, she said. She comes in at 5:54 when Theo cycles the east vestibule. She scrolled, stopped, and tapped. I started counting because I didn't trust my own eyes. She read from her notes the way nurses read dosage orders. Exact and stripped of ornament. 58 passers-by between those two times. 58. A pastor from First Assembly in a tan Buick at 319. An off-duty county deputy still wearing department outerwear at 347. 2 school board members leaving a donor committee meeting at 412. A pharmacy representative with sample bags at 426. A hospital volunteer with a crosspin, and a blanket cart at 441. A neighbor from Lily's Street at 503, identified later from registration footage. No one stopped long enough to ask a single question, Sandra said. A few looked. Most didn't. The indictment did not need volume. It already had numbers. Doug stared at the frozen image, the little bowed sign barely legible under snow, and felt that old pressure behind his ribs he used to mistake for temper. It was not temper. It was recognition. He had seen crowds step around a bleeding man outside a bar in '98 because they did not want statements taken. He had seen a veteran sleep 3 nights under a courthouse awning while church traffic flowed around him with casserole dishes and polished shoes. People always said they had not understood what they were seeing. The truth was harsher and simpler. They understood enough to keep moving. At 6:07, the corridor clock clicked forward with a sound like a cheap lighter snapping shut. Sandra scrolled one more pane and held it there. Lily was lifting a cup toward a woman tugging a rolling oxygen bag. The woman's face pinched, turned away, and vanished into snow. Lily set the untouched cup on the curb and reached for another with the same measured hand. She wasn't crying, Sandra said, and the line came out flatter than grief and heavier than anger. That's what got me when I pulled footage. She looked like she was on shift. Lily did not look up at her own image. She kept her eyes on room 214's narrow window and listened for changes in Eli's machine rhythm, the way adults listened for weather sirens. Doug asked, "Aid office, close her out?" Sandra nodded once. "Window shut at 4:30. Sign says voucher requests in 7 to 10 business days." She slid the tablet against her chest and glanced toward the elevators where 2 visitors stood pretending not to watch the man in leather on the floor beside a child. They told her family that this afternoon. I heard the clerk say it myself when I was grabbing lab stickers. "Family," Doug said. "Grandmother signed intake. No car. Went home to bring dry clothes, got stuck behind a jackknifed semi near mile marker 12. Called once. Phone died." Sandra's jaw tightened. That left the 7-year-old to solve a copay in a blizzard while grown people counted her as background. She was careful with tone, but the moral weight sat in every clipped word. Doug respected that. Outrage that arrived late and loud was usually performance. This was accounting. A volunteer rounded the corner with a new stack of admission forms and slowed when she saw Sandra's tablet and Doug's cut. "Everything okay here?" she asked, voice thin with caution. Sandra answered without looking away from Doug. "Everything should have been handled 2 hours ago." The volunteer stood another second, then moved on. Lily's shoulders lifted once with a shallow breath. She pulled the envelope from her lap, reopened it, and checked the bills again as if numbers might have changed while adults talked over her. $22, damp and flattening at the corners, despite all her effort. She put the folded 5 back in line with the singles, straightened them by denomination, and sealed the flap with both thumbs. Her motions were meticulous, almost ceremonial, and each one accused the corridor more than any speech could have. Doug looked from the envelope to the closed door of 214 and back to the phone in his hand. The hinge pressed into his palm. He still had not opened it. He wanted one clear line before he moved, one sentence from the child that left no room for any adult to pretend confusion later. Lily gave it to him without lifting her head. "Please don't let them stop his medicine," she whispered. The words were smaller this time, frayed at the edges from repetition, but they landed harder because she said them like terms of surrender she had negotiated with herself. Not save me, not help us. That one line. Keep the medicine coming, keep his lungs open through the night. Doug turned his body so he faced her fully, knees protesting as he shifted on tile. He kept his voice low enough that it stayed inside the 3 feet between them. "Look at me, Lily." She did. Her eyes were ringed with fatigue and fixed with the kind of discipline children should never need. "You hear me now," he said. "You are done earning this by yourself." Her throat worked once. She did not cry. She nodded as if agreeing to a contract. From inside 214, Eli coughed twice, a dry sawtooth sound, then settled back into the machine's measured hiss. Lily flinched at the cough and reached for the door frame without standing, fingertips touching paint worn smooth by years of family hands. Someone had drawn a smiling kite on the wall there, and its marker outline had faded to a ghost of blue. She kept one hand on that wall while she spoke again, still whispering. "They said, if we can't pay tonight, they can't send it home," she said. "They said come back with authorization." She swallowed and pressed her mittenless hand under her opposite arm for warmth. I don't know what authorization is." Doug's face did not change, but something in it set. "It's paper," he said. "Paper's not your job." She looked at his vest, at the stitched patch over his chest, at the scar under his cheekbone, at hands that looked built for damage and were lying open on his thighs like tools waiting for instruction. "Are you going to tell them," she asked, "or are you going to make them?" He held that gaze. Both. At 6:12, snow struck the windows harder, a granular rush against glass that made the corridor lights seem warmer than they were. The engine rumble outside shifted from scattered idles to brief coordinated bursts, riders repositioning in short arcs near the loading zone. No one revved for show. The sound moved through the building's frame like distant thunder crossing steel. Sandra leaned in just enough for Doug to hear. "If you call your people, keep the hall clear for respiratory carts. I don't care how many cuts they wear." She tipped her chin toward Lily. "And keep her out of line of sight if anybody from aid office comes up to explain policy at her." Doug gave one short nod. "Lane stays clear." Sandra studied him for a beat and decided, "I'll log what I saw and flag administration. Videos archived to incident file by end of shift." She looked at Lily. "Your brother's treatment is running. You stay right here." Then she moved toward the station, already typing with her thumb as she walked, her steps quick and controlled. Doug opened the flip phone. The tiny screen cast a pale square of light across his knuckles. His contact list was short and old, names entered in block letters years back and never edited for sentiment. He scrolled to Pike, Reggie, and pressed call. Static crackled once, then a click and breathing over wind. "Yeah," Reggie said. Doug kept it to one line, same cadence he had used on convoy radios when extra words cost time. "Peds wing, Riverton General, 10 minutes. A pause, no longer than one breath. "Copy," Reggie said, and the line went dead. Doug closed the phone and slid it back inside his vest. He did not explain 10 minutes to Lily. He did not explain chapter trees, winter call chains, who would peel off from bridge posts and county roads and machine shops and diners when that phrase moved through them. He sat beside her on the cold tile, shoulder near hers, eyes on a room 214, and ears on the building as it held its breath between request and arrival. The first change was so low it hid under the hospital's ordinary machinery. A pressure more than a noise, as if a freight elevator had started somewhere deep in the foundation and kept rising without ever reaching a floor. Doug felt it through the tile before he heard it cleanly, a faint pulse under his boots that traveled up his shins and settled behind his sternum, in the old place where Convoy Dread used to live. The corridor fluorescence gave a brief tremor. The loose coins in the vending machine's return tray clicked once against metal. Lily turned her head toward the outer wall, not because she recognized engines, but because children recognize shifts in adult posture, and every adult in that hall had just gone still at the same time. The second wave came broader, layered, no single throttle standing out. A disciplined swell rolling over the river bridge and threading through Caldwell's narrowed streets, with the cadence of riders who had done this in weather before. Sound reached the building first, then reflected off the concrete service bay, and came back thicker until the windows in the family corridor answered with a thin, sympathetic buzz. Sandra looked up from the nurse's station, fingers suspended above her tablet. A respiratory tech pushing an oxygen cart stopped and listened with her mouth slightly open, then kept moving because oxygen still outranked spectacle. Through the muted television, the meteorologist kept shaping warnings no one read. Lily shifted closer to Doug without appearing to move. Her shoulder touched his sleeve and stayed there. Room 214's monitor continued its measured pattern, indifferent to weather and rumor, indifferent to county prejudice and club patches and who had failed whom by the hour. Doug kept his eyes on that door. He had asked for 10 minutes. The men outside were giving him 9. A security radio cracked at the end of the corridor, all static and clipped breath. East and north, approaches full. Formation holding. No disturbance. Another voice, younger, trying for procedure over nerves. Copy. Confirm count at intake perimeter. The reply took 3 seconds and arrived with ceremonial precision, each number separated as if someone had written it down before speaking. 300 motorcycles, 300 riders, 300 helmets, all stationary on command. The words moved faster than the engines had. A woman near the elevator bank clutched her coat collar with one hand and her son's discharge packet with the other, eyes wide at the number she had heard in the waiting room and was hearing again with official cadence. 2 men in business jackets stepped to the window at the corridor bend and stared down into sleet-streaked darkness, where headlamps shone in ordered ranks instead of the chaos they had prepared themselves to witness. Nobody in that hallway said apology. Nobody had reached that part yet. But a few of them stepped back from their assumptions, one shoe length at a time. By 6:18 on that Thursday night, the storm had turned the parking lot into alternating bands of white drift and black slush, and the hospital district looked less like a civic space than a temporary outpost built to survive the next hour. Doug rose carefully, knees ticking, and helped Lily to her feet. She kept the envelope tucked inside her coat with both hands, the way a child carried a secret she had paid for. He guided her to the inside corner beside the family room door, away from direct sight lines from the elevators and the corridor camera, above the hand sanitizer dispenser. Not hidden, sheltered. She watched him with grave concentration, then watched room 214 again. Her yellow flower clip had shifted loose. He reached as if to fix it, and stopped short, letting her do it herself. She set it straight in 2 small movements and nodded once when she was done. The rumble peaked and then dropped in coordinated sequence as engines cut row by row. The silence after felt larger than the sound, filled with ticking exhaust and wind rattling the unsealed east doors downstairs. Doug could map the lot without seeing it. Front pair at pediatric entrance, second line offset to keep emergency lane open, rear bikes angled for rapid exit, if ambulances needed right-of-way. Reggie trained for logistics because logistics kept people alive. Theater got people hurt. Sandra came back up the hall with a printed incident sheet in one hand and 3 wristbands in the other, already multitasking the way night shift nurses did when policy lagged behind necessity. She stopped beside Doug and angled her body so she could see Lily and the corridor simultaneously. House supervisor wants no one obstructing transport, she said. Administrators coming up from first floor. Her glance flicked toward the windows where silhouettes gathered. And we have visitors filming through glass. Doug followed her gaze. 2 phones were already raised at the far end, cameras aimed past the reflection of their own faces toward the snowed-in ranks below. He did not swear. He said, "Can you reroute family overflow to south chairs?" "Already started," Sandra said. "I need this hall clear in 90 seconds. He nodded and stepped into motion. The change in him was immediate and quiet, the same reflex that had made him useful in bad places long before anyone called it kindness. He pointed to the respiratory tech and then to the cross-corridor doors. Cart traffic center line only. To a janitor with a caution cone. Cone that's spilled by the vending machine. No slip points. To a volunteer hovering with blankets and uncertainty. Take 2 to room 214 family chair and keep 1 dry by this wall. No barking, no performance. Work language. People obeyed because he sounded like someone who had already counted the cost of delay. Then the riders came inside in 2s, not through the main lobby where fear clustered, but through the pediatric side entrance security had cracked for controlled access. Wet boots on tile, leather darkened with sleet, gloves clipped to belts, helmets under arms, beaded with meltwater. They looked exactly like the town's cautionary tales until you watched what they did. First man through wiped his boots on the mat without being told. Second man moved a waiting room stroller out of a doorway and set it back with both brakes engaged. Third checked with security before he took a single step past the yellow line. Nobody flooded the hall. Nobody raised a voice. Reggie Pike arrived 7th in line, broad shoulders under a cut whitened at the seams by road salt, beard wet, eyes clear and scanning. He and Doug exchanged one look that carried assignment, constraints, and timeline in less than a heartbeat. Reggie nodded toward Lily, then toward room 214, then toward the stairwell that led to billing and pharmacy. Doug answered with 2 fingers. "Keep lane. Shield child." Reggie repeated the gesture to the men behind him, and the wall began. They built it with arithmetic. 6 riders at each end of the pediatric corridor, offset in pairs to keep a 6-foot center lane open for carts and staff. 4 posted by the elevator alcove to redirect gawkers and lower voices. 8 downstairs at the pediatric entrance, rotating in 20-minute cold shifts, scraping and salting the walkway so transport wheels would not skid. 3 with EMT backgrounds stationed by the automatic doors only for lift assist, hands visible, no patient contact unless asked by staff. 2 riders in clean gloves sent to the pharmacy window with printed medication numbers from Sandra. 1 to stand in line, 1 to document the refusal language if refusal came again. 1 legal aid member, patched but carrying a county paralegal badge, walked to billing with Doug's copied denial forms and Lily's handwritten envelope amount documented on a witness sheet. The corridor changed shape around that structure. Parents who had braced for threat now found themselves guided, gently and without fanfare, around safer pathways cleared of spilled slush and abandoned meal trays. A rider with a spiderweb tattoo on his neck crouched, to tighten a loose wheel lock on an IV pole that kept drifting into the walking lane. Another held the fire door while transport pushed through with a child under warm blankets, then returned to his post without looking toward the phones still recording. A third stood with his back to the windows, broad enough to block line of sight to Lily's corner from the elevator camera. He never looked at her directly, only at the corridor beyond her, giving privacy by pretending not to notice what mattered most. Lily watched all of it with the solemn attention of someone trying to understand a new language by context. She edged closer to Doug when the first cluster of leather jackets passed, then relaxed when she saw where they stopped and how they stood. Shoulders outward, lane open, hands empty. No one asked her for the envelope. No one told her to smile for gratitude. Sandra brought her a cup of warm water because hot drinks upset empty stomachs too fast, and Lily held it in both hands until the color returned to her fingertips. She still did not cry. Downstairs, the county radio count repeated, now with route annotations and access notes, as if dispatch itself had accepted that these men were part of the operational picture, whether anyone liked the optics or not. Pediatric ingress maintained. Emergency lane clear. Crowd controlled. The language was bureaucratic, almost dry. It was also, for the first time that night, accurate. At 6:31, the hospital administrator, in a Navy suit that had not been made for sleet, came onto the floor with two supervisors and a stack of forms clipped too tightly at the top. He slowed when he saw the corridor geometry already in place, staff moving faster, families quieter, transport lane clear. No shouting, no disorder, only 300 reputations standing between a child and another procedural delay. He asked Sandra for status. She handed him the incident sheet, the camera timestamps, and the pharmacy note with the copay deficit circled in black. She did not soften a single detail. Doug stood beside Lily and said nothing while the administrator read. Reggie held the far end of the corridor and watched the elevator doors. Outside, engines sat cooling under snow, a dark grid of waiting steel and patient men. Inside, the wall held exactly as designed, not as a threat, not as spectacle, but as a temporary structure of witness, forcing every office that had closed at 4:30 to remain open long enough to see what their schedule had asked a 7-year-old to carry. The administrator finished the first page and went back to the top, lips moving over the timestamps as if a second reading might change them. Snowwater dripped from the hem of his suit trousers onto the terrazzo and spread in a dark oval near his shoe. Sandra stood with her tablet against her ribs and waited. Doug watched the man's face do the slow work of recalculation. 58 passers-by, a 7-year-old, an aid window closed at 4:30, a copay shortfall of $16.40, and 300 riders holding a hallway, quieter than it had been all afternoon. What is the exact amount to release Eli Harper's inhaler and starter meds tonight? The administrator asked. Sandra answered before anyone else could soften it. $38.40 at discharge window, $22 collected by the sister outside in weather exposure conditions, deficit $16.40, pharmacy requested same-day authorization code or payment. Lily pulled the envelope from her coat and held it out with both hands. The paper had gone limp from melted snow and body heat, and the smiling dinosaur sticker near the flap had one corner peeling loose. "It's all there," she whispered. "I counted 3 times." The administrator took the envelope like evidence, not charity, and nodded to the supervisor beside him. "Reopen the charity desk now," he said. "Use emergency override on pediatric respiratory discharge." He looked at Sandra. "Attach this to incident documentation." Then he turned toward Doug and Reggie, looked at the riders bracing both ends of the corridor, and added, "Maintain your clear lane. We are moving this. At 6:49, a billing clerk who had left at 5:30 came back up with wet hair and a portable receipt printer tucked under her arm. Melissa Crow followed with a metal cash box and a stack of pink forms, face pale from the cold and from something more difficult than cold. She stopped when she saw Doug, and he recognized the unfinished sentence from admissions in the way she held her breath before speaking. "I said you should leave before this turned into," she said, voice low. She glanced at Lily and then at the riders salting the entrance through the window. "I never had a word for this. I was wrong anyway." Doug gave her one short nod, not absolution, not accusation, just acknowledgement that she had finished the sentence. The legal aid rider returned from billing at 7:03 with a witness sheet clipped to a board, snow crystals still clinging to his beard. His name tag read Cal Rutledge, and the county paralegal badge at his belt had a crack across the laminate. He set 3 documents on the temporary desk Melissa had reopened. Lily's envelope count verified at $22, the aid office refusal language copied verbatim from the posted window sign, and a handwritten note from pharmacy confirming medication, hold pending authorization. Every paper that had hidden behind policy now sat under fluorescent light with names attached. Sandra entered the incident file number into her tablet and read it aloud for the record. RG-IR-2419. Weather exposure minor. Administrative delay. Corrective action in progress. She uploaded the parking lot clips, including the frame where Lily lifted a cup toward the woman with the oxygen bag and kept her hand steady when the woman passed. Then she printed 2 copies, one for administration and one for patient advocacy, and slid both into clear sleeves so the ink would not blur from wet gloves. By 7:26, the house supervisor brought portable heaters to the east vestibule where the towels still sat wedged in the lower track of the cracked automatic door. 2 riders helped maintenance seat a temporary seal strip without stepping over the yellow line. The silver-mustached guard with the knee brace, who had earlier locked the crash bar with shaking hands, leaned on his radio and reported to dispatch in a voice that had settled. "Perimeter stable. Civilian assistance cooperative. No interference with care pathways." County dispatch repeated his words back, and the repeating mattered. At 8:11, Theo the transporter came up from emergency with a dead phone charging on a rolling workstation and the stuffed penguin keychain swinging from his badge reel. He had found Lily's grandmother in intake after highway units diverted traffic around mile marker 12. Mrs. Harper arrived in borrowed snow boots and a coat buttoned wrong, face raw from wind and worry. She crossed the corridor in 6 quick steps and crouched in front of Lily, hands on the child's shoulders, checking eyes, cheeks, fingers, shoes. No speech at first, only touch. Then, "I'm here," she said, and Lily leaned forward once and held. Melissa completed the charity override at 8:24, while Cal stood witness and Sandra checked each field for error. The form required a reason code. The administrator wrote it himself in block letters. Immediate pediatric respiratory need. During weather emergency. He signed, dated, and time-stamped. The printer jammed on the second page, coughed, then fed clean paper. Melissa tore the receipt free, stamped paid authorized, and handed 1 copy to Mrs. Harper, 1 to pharmacy runner, 1 to incident file. Lily's envelope and cash were counted into the drawer in front of her, and Melissa pushed the register display toward the child so she could see the number settle at 0.00 due tonight. Doug's VA folder sat where he had left it on the blue chair, edges curling from melted snow. Sandra noticed it during a med run, squared the pages, and set it beside him. "Your reimbursement fight didn't vanish," she said. "Not tonight," he replied. Cal tapped the folder with one gloved finger. I scanned your denial letters downstairs while we waited for signatures, he said. Patient advocacy and billing logged an emergency grievance filing tonight under case RG-BL-1172, time-stamped 8:41 p.m. Collections hold is active, late fees frozen, and reimbursement review is formally docketed. He set a carbon copy stamped Received 2041 on top of Doug's papers. Doug looked at him, surprised once, then tucked the stamped copy into the folder under his arm. Thread tied. By 9:37, the 300 had rotated into warming cycles without breaking the corridor pattern. 40 remained inside or at the pediatric entrance at any given interval. The rest stood down in staggered groups at diner lots and church overhangs, then came back on schedule. Reggie kept the board in his head and updated by hand signal. The man with the spiderweb tattoo carried fresh salt bags in from a county truck after the off-duty deputy, from the parking footage, now hat in both hands, asked where to drop them and stayed to spread 2 loads himself. Nobody announced that change. It happened and was seen. At 10:52, pharmacy called up with confirmation that Eli's inhaler, spacer, and overnight NEB supplies were released to pediatric respiratory under emergency authorization. Sandra took the call on speaker so the corridor heard the exact words and no one could later trim them into something smaller. She read back lot numbers and expiration dates, then signed chain of custody with the charge nurse and placed the sealed medication bag on the counter outside room 214 in Lily's line of sight. Lily did not touch it. She watched Sandra verify the label against Eli's wristband first, then nodded once when told it matched. Near midnight, the building settled into that thin hospital quiet where every sound carried farther. Elevator cables humming, distant floor buffer, sleet tapping high windows. The weather captions on the muted television still lagged one line behind the meteorologist's mouth. The flickering fluorescent over admissions, the one that pulsed every 9 seconds, had finally gone dark and been replaced. The cracked vestibule door held its seal for 2 full cycles before it stuttered open again. At 12:14 a.m., Eli's breathing had gone from sawtooth to steady under fresh treatment. The monitor in room 214 kept an even tempo that no longer made Lily flinch. Sandra stepped out, removed one glove, and gave Mrs. Harper a small nod that contained the whole update. Mrs. Harper pressed her fingertips to her lips and then to Eli's blanket inside the doorway. Lily walked to the vending machine, lifted the lemonade jug with both hands, and tilted what remained into one last paper cup. The drink came out pale and mostly meltwater, with a thin yellow ribbon along the rim. She carried it to Doug, who stood with his back against the wall, VA folder under one arm. Helmetless riders posted like quiet fence posts down the corridor. She raised the cup to him. He took it in his scarred hand, fingers careful around soft paper so it would not collapse. Then she tucked her own hand into the gap around his first 2 knuckles and held on, as if testing a rail before crossing. Sometimes a town learns too late that reputation is costume and character is labor. Sometimes the people it feared most are the ones who stay long enough to make the paperwork tell the truth.